Ida, you're muted. Sorry.
So can you unmute me?
You're unmuted now.
I'm muted now. Okay. I'll start all over. Welcome to everyone. Let's Talk Democracy is a grassroots group in Queens, New York, dedicated to educating people about our government, encouraging dialogue about the basic foundations of our democracy, and encouraging citizens to make their voices heard. I am Ida Masana, founder of Let's Talk Democracy, and we welcome our regulars, we welcome our newcomers, and in case you are not on our email list and you want to be, please drop me a line at our website, which is www.letstalkdemocracy.org with your contact information, and I will be happy to add you to our email list. Over the next few months, I will be exploring ways to expand our network. And if you have any ideas on how to reach more people, any expertise in social media, or reaching out specifically to younger people, I would very much appreciate if you would come forward and contact me. Thank you for noticing the time change. To accommodate as many people as possible, we have changed the time to 7 p.m. tonight and likely going forward. If there is any serious objection to this later time from our loyal participants, we can consider reversing it. So don't be shy, let me know. A note to thank Michelle Aragon for her beautiful artwork and for maintaining our website. And Donna will also be in the background tonight helping with the tech. And Professor Krasner will be our speaker to help us understand the outcome of the midterm elections we just had, even though some final results are still pending. The etiquette on Zoom is for everyone to stay muted throughout this program to minimize background noise. We look forward to a lively discussion. When our speaker is finished, you will be called on and you can unmute while speaking. This session is being recorded, but for privacy concerns, we are trying the speaker-only view, and we'll stop the recording at the Q&A time. For those not familiar with Zoom, take a moment to notice the chat function at the bottom of your screen and the electronic hand raise in the participants function. Calendar time, December 15th will be our next event, and an interesting and different one too. Jonathan Rosenberg, a graduate of Juilliard, PhD from Harvard, and history professor at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of CUNY, and author of a book on this topic called Dangerous Melodies, will talk about pianists, dictators, and cultural ambassadors, world politics, and classical music in America, to explore the relationship between art and politics, and historically how artists fit in to the political developments of the world. A wonderful way to close out the year. Hope to see you there on Thursday, December 15th at 7 p.m. As always, our programs are free and accessible from anywhere on Zoom. Please spread the word. We depend on you to get the word out. And now, to introduce our speaker. Michael Krasner is no stranger to us here at Let's Talk Democracy and is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Queens College and co-director of the Taft Institute for Government. So many of you know that Michael Krasner went to the University of Chicago and got his PhD from Columbia. He is an award-winning professor and huge supporter of Let's Talk Democracy from its very early days 5 years ago. He returns tonight to set us straight on the midterm elections, what happened, why, and where we go from here. So take it away, Michael. You're muted.
Okay, trying again. Thank you, Ida, and thank you, Donna and Michelle, for your help. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint. Okay, and now we're going to go to slideshow, and we're going to go all the way back up. Oh, that wasn't a good plan. Hang on, we'll get there. Okay, so here we are at the beginning. And I'm offering you a kind of one-sentence summary saying that this election looked very threatening, as I talked about with you in September, but we dodged the bullet. But the threat remains. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about how the threat may be disguised. So that's previews of coming attractions. Here's the more detailed outline of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to review the long-term threat to democracy.
Michael, you're muted again. Sorry.
How's that?
Okay.
Okay. So I'm calling this the long and the short of it. And I'm going to begin with a quick review of the long-term threat to democracy, because I think that's important in terms of context and in terms of understanding what happened in the short run. And then I will look in more detail at the 2022 results and the aftermath, particularly the way the media treated Trump's announcement speech and the way they've been treating DeSantis, which I think is very telling. In terms of the results, we'll look at the defeat of election deniers, the really surprising Democratic victory in the Senate, and try to offer some explanation about why things went the way they did, and then end by talking about where the threat to democracy stands now. So let's see. So in the long-term trend, the thing I want to emphasize here is that all of this predates Trump by quite a lot. The trend in the Republican Party to authoritarianism or autocracy or semi-fascism or outright fascism, whatever you want to call it, goes back much further than Trump. If you look at the history, I would start with the 1960s and 70s, when grassroots groups began to gain power in the United States. The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement pulled the whole political system, and the other movements that I've listed here pulled the whole political system to the left quite substantially. And the result was a backlash in the elite. And by elite here, I mean the financial elite, the people with money. The billionaires and the leaders of the big corporations pushed back against the growing power of citizen groups and used their financial resources to greatly expand the war chest of the Republican Party, to recruit and train and finance candidates, which they continue to do down to the present day. After January 6th, there was a brief pause when some corporations said, well, you know, we can't support anybody who challenges the results of the 2020 elections. And they withdrew support from the 139 Republican members of the House and the 8 Republican senators who voted to overturn those results. That has changed. They are now giving money to all of those people. So the big corporations, the Coke network and Home Depot and United Parcel and a whole bunch of other big corporations have gone back, despite the pious words that they pronounced in January of 2021. They've all gone back to financing the election deniers. So this alliance between big money and the extreme Republican Party continues down to the present day, but it began back in the 60s and 70s. So we're looking at a 60, 50, 60-year trend here. What else did money buy? It bought the creation of think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, which had considerable influence over the media and through the media over public opinion. It also brought influence at universities. And all of this was aimed at promoting a very right-wing ideology, a very strongly free market ideology, libertarian point of view, you know, government's bad, market is good. But in addition to that, it was also opposed to the movements we talked about before. In particular, it was anti-civil rights. And that was an important element because it made it possible for the Republican Party to appeal to the white Southerners who had, since the Civil War, voted for the Democratic Party, but who were alienated from the Democratic Party when first Kennedy and then Johnson supported the civil rights movement. So they were ripe for an appeal, and it was the Republican Party that made that appeal. They, beginning with Goldwater and continuing with Nixon and Reagan, all down to the present day, they appealed to that racist white element in the South and to a lesser extent in the North, with considerable success. You know that the states of the old Confederacy are now a solidly Republican bloc, with hardly a Democrat elected from any of those states, with the possible exception of people like Joe Manchin. So this was a very successful strategy for the Republican Party. And it's important to understand that it was consistent, that even candidates and presidents who have the image of being nice guys supported this strategy. Ronald Reagan, for example, began his campaign for president in 1980 in Neshoba County, Mississippi, 7 miles from a town called Philadelphia, Mississippi. Why is this important? What happened in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and what did Reagan have to say about it? Well, those of you who know your history know that in 1964, the civil rights movement launched something called Freedom Summer, an attempt to bring a lot of volunteers into the South, in particular to register people to vote. Among them were James Chaney, an African-American civil rights worker who was actually born in Mississippi, Michael Schwerner, a veteran activist from New York, and Andrew Goodman, 21-year-old student at Queens College, the college I taught at for 50 years, who came to Mississippi as part of Freedom Summer and had been there for 2 whole days at the time this incident occurred. They were driving a car in Philadelphia. They were stopped by the local sheriff, who was himself a member of the Ku Klux Klan, taken to the local jail, ostensibly because of a traffic violation. They are turned over to the Ku Klux Klan, who brutally murdered them and buried them in an earthen dam. They were discovered 2 months later, after national outcry. So here's Reagan in 1980, only 16 years later, 7 miles from the place where all this happened. And what did he say about this incident? He said nothing. But in the speech that he gave, announcing the beginning of his campaign, he did say that he believed in states' rights and that he would restore to states and local governments the power, that should say, that properly represents them. My apologies for the typo. Now that phrase, states' rights, had been used by segregationists for decades and decades. Strom Thurmond and other people who were supporters of segregation had used states' rights as a justification for the abuse of Black people. So the message that Reagan was sending, both by what he said and what he didn't say, is that if elected president, he would not support civil rights for Black people, and that he would support white supremacy in the South and maybe elsewhere. Similarly, Republican Party made an appeal to evangelicals, and here there's some overlap, because one of the issues that angered evangelicals was that under the Democrats, the Internal Revenue Service denied evangelicals tax-exempt status for the whites-only schools that they created after segregation was outlawed in the public schools by the Supreme Court. In addition, evangelicals were ripe for recruitment because of the Roe versus Wade decision, which gave women control over their bodies and allowed them to have abortions, which they had not previously had access to in many states. So that's a second big block within the Republican Party. So you've got whites and you've got Christian fundamentalists, and add a little nationalism to this, the idea that the United States is always right. and should be #1 in the world, and reinforce that with people like Rush Limbaugh, who are coming into great prominence in right-wing talk radio and Fox News on TV, and put in a little lacing of misogyny and homophobia, and you've got the seeds of the kind of extremism that we see in the Republican Party now. In addition to these issue stands, the Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich, who became powerful in the party in 1994 when he led the Republicans to victory, again, an off-year election where they took over both houses of the Congress. Gingrich worked with a media consultant named Frank Luntz, and they devised a whole set of terms, language, things that Republicans should say to galvanize voters on their behalf and to demonize the opposition. And Luntz and Gingrich taught people to say that the Democrats were corrupt and sick and traitors. And the crucial thing to understand here is that you go from a political system where both parties recognize the legitimacy of the other party. You know, we're all Americans, may not agree with you. You think big government's good, we oppose it, but we're all Americans. We're in this together. Go from that to a situation where the other side is seen as the enemy, as wanting to destroy everything that's good. The fancier term for this is that the other side is considered to be an existential threat, a threat to one's existence, a threat to everything that somebody holds dear. Simpler way of saying it is that they go from being opponents to being enemies. So in this process, the Republicans come to adopt very extreme positions. Here's a partial list. They're the only Western party, only party in the democratic world to deny climate change. They have the most extreme position on abortion. You know, some of the state parties have already gone ahead and abolished abortion in all cases, no exceptions for rape, no exceptions for incest. They oppose nearly all government regulation of business. They oppose nearly all social programs, including Social Security and Medicare. The head of the Senate campaign committee for the Republicans proposed cutting both of those. And they're in favor of large tax cuts for rich people and big corporations. Now, it will not come as a stunning surprise to you that these are not popular positions. You cannot win elections if these are your positions on the issues. And part of the proof of this is that in the last 8 presidential elections in the United States, the Republicans have lost the popular vote 7 times. So if you can't win on your positions, what can you do? You can adopt extreme methods to keep the people who are likely to vote against you from getting to the polls. And that's exactly what the Republicans have done. They have engaged in voter intimidation, voter suppression, election subversion, and used violence for all these things. Crucial point again is all this is pre-Trump. He's not to blame for any of this. He's not on the scene yet. First example, voter intimidation. The Republican National Committee for 35 years was under a court order preventing it from engaging in voter intimidation. What kinds of things had they done to produce this result? Well, one little bit of history is that William Rehnquist, who went on to become Chief Justice of the United States, when he was a lawyer in Arizona, was observed by witnesses going up and down the lines of waiting voters in minority communities, asking people if they were literate, challenging whether they were properly registered, reminding them that casting a vote illegally was a felony. In other words, trying to intimidate them. In addition, the specific act that got the Republican National Committee placed under court order was that they hired a whole bunch of off-duty policemen who, still wearing their service weapons, patrolled Black polling places with armbands suggesting that they were part of a national outfit protecting voting security. And again, this was concentrated in Black communities, an obvious attempt to intimidate. In 2000, in the year 2000, when his brother was running for president, that's George W. Bush running for president, Jeb Bush, who was the governor of governor of Florida at the time, sent state police to patrol Black polling places. Again, an obvious attempt at intimidation. Voter suppression. This means keeping people from getting to the polls by quasi-legal means, purging the voter rolls. And this is something that's done routinely. You try to get dead people off the rolls and so on. Again, in Florida, same year, that very close election, Jeb Bush ran a purge of the voting rolls that was supposedly aimed at getting rid of convicted felons, but was done so loosely, so broadly, and so carelessly on purpose that it knocked hundreds and even thousands of Black voters who had never committed a crime in their lives off the polls. The margin of victory, you'll recall, was only 537 votes. There's a very good movie about this by Robert Greenwald called Unprecedented, which I recommend if you haven't seen it. Voter suppression, second example. The second time that Bush ran, 2004, when he was running for re-election, the Secretary of State in Ohio, the state government official in charge of the election, drastically cut the number of polling places and voting machines in minority communities and on college campuses. The state went narrowly to Bush. It was the crucial state in that election, gave him his second term. Turn now to election subversion and violence. Election subversion means taking hold of the machinery of the election in order to get your candidate to win. And here again, the election of 2000 provides us with some examples. When the recount was in process and seemed to be favoring Al Gore, Roger Stone, remember Roger Stone? He was active all the way back then. Roger Stone organized what has come to be called the Brooks Brothers Riot. Republican congressional aides, staffers who normally worked in Washington, were flown down to Florida, still wearing their Brooks Brothers outfits. That's the origin of the name, where they violently attacked the offices where the recount was taking place in Dade County and succeeded in shutting it down. This set the stage for the Supreme Court to intervene to stop the recount altogether and give the presidency to George Bush. So the Supreme Court takeover is the election subversion, and the violence is the Brooks Brothers riot. Now, if we shift our attention to the 2022 midterms, keeping that context in mind, talked with you all in September about the threat. One way to think about the threat is that it was aimed at institutionalizing, making permanent what the Republicans had only done in fits and starts over the past 20 or 30 years. Remember that there were a whole bunch of election deniers, who are better called election riggers, running for crucial state offices, offices where they would have control of elections, governors, secretaries of state, attorneys general. If they had won, they could have done all the things that we just talked about because they would have been in charge. They can intimidate, suppress, and subvert. They could even, in 2024, have reversed the results of their state's election. They could have said, well, there was fraud, there was, irregularities, and even though the Democrat, supposedly got 55% of the popular vote in our state, we're throwing out 6% of that vote, and that means the Republican won, and that means the electoral votes from our state go to the Republican. That would have meant the destruction of democracy in the United States, because the essence of democracy, as you all know, is exactly majority rule. The very good news about this election is that in every battleground state, in every state where it mattered, those election riggers, people who had basically promised that if they were elected, they would always corrupt the process and make sure that a Republican won, they were defeated in every battleground state. There was more very good news. As you know, the Democrats held the Senate, and this was against all the odds. It's normal for a new president's party to lose seats in the Senate and seats in the House of Representatives in the first off-year election, the first midterm election. Obama, for instance, lost 63 seats in the House of Representatives, 2010. This is especially true if the president's running a low approval rating, and Biden is, he's around 42%. It's also supposed to be true if there's economic problems, and there's a big economic problem, inflation. And if people think that the country's moving in the wrong direction, well, 3/4 of the American people think that. Democrats bucked all those trends. They are going to control the Senate again, and they may get the 51st seat in the Senate in Georgia in the runoff. And that, by the way, would be important, because if it's 50-50, then all the committees are divided 50-50. It's much harder to do business. If they get the 51st seat, then they get majorities in all the Senate committees, and they can do things much faster. But even just with the 50, even if they lose that runoff, it's very important because it means that they can approve Biden's judicial appointments. And the last count I saw was that there were 83 vacancies in the federal courts. That's a lot. If Biden gets to appoint all 83 of those and they all go through, that's a good balance, a good counter to what Trump was able to do in his 4 years. Obviously not going to change the balance on the Supreme Court unless there is some kind of higher intervention to create vacancies there. More good news at the state level. The Republicans did not gain the supermajorities that they were seeking in the states of North Carolina and Wisconsin, and they lost one house in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. They lost complete control in Michigan and Massachusetts and Maryland. On the other side of the ledger, they did gain a super majority in Nebraska, but that's a pretty red state to begin with. In terms of ballot measures, the Republicans lost on all 5 ballot measures that involved reproductive freedom. Abortion rights became part of the constitutions in the 3 states mentioned here, Vermont, California, and Michigan. And abortion rights were also protected in Kentucky. And the proposal in Montana that would have mandated healthcare, medical intervention for critically ill, basically doomed newborn infants, that was defeated as well. So those poor children will not be subjected to draconian measures that won't have any good effect on them. So why? What's the explanation for why the Democrats bucked all these trends? I'm going to break this down into 4 factors: issues, candidates, campaigns, and then the way different groups voted. In terms of issues, somebody mentioned before we began formally that Justice Alito must be a secret Democrat because he handed the Democrats, the crucial issue for the 2022 campaign by overturning Roe versus Wade. This is the famous or infamous Dobbs decision. And by putting reproductive rights and women's freedom to choose on the agenda, the Supreme Court created a very powerful issue that motivated a lot of women and also a lot of young people who registered and voted in very high numbers. So that's one crucial factor in terms of issues. Democracy was also an important issue. You may remember that President Biden gave 2 speeches on this and caught a lot of flack for it. people were saying, no, we should be talking about the economy. That's what's on people's minds. And true confessions, I was one of those people who said that, and I was 100% wrong. It turned out that democracy was a strong motivator for voters, along with abortion. And not only did people defeat most of the extremist election deniers, but they came out and voted in Senate elections and the state legislative elections that we've already talked about. So democracy proved to be a strong motivator as well. And Biden should get credit for talking about that issue. They have made a big difference. Here's the analysis from the New York Times numbers guy, who I think has done a good job on this election. He breaks the election down state by state, and his analysis says where democracy or abortion was in the foreground, was really on the agenda, the voters responded. Whether it was a state that had a referendum, or whether it was a state that had election deniers, like Arizona or Pennsylvania and so on, the others listed here, seen as a threat. Wherever people perceive that one or the other of those issues, abortion or democracy, was at stake, they came out and voted, and they won. So I shift now to the question of candidates. And it's, a lot of people have said this, but it's worth repeating because it did matter. The Republicans, partly because of Trump's influence, nominated a whole bunch of unqualified, inexperienced candidates who ran really bad campaigns, did a lot of stupid things that cost them votes. And this became so obvious that even Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, complained about the quality of the candidates and said that it might cost them the Senate, and indeed it did. Here are some of the examples. Herschel Walker may be the most egregious, but this guy Baldock in New Hampshire was also very extreme. He'd run for other offices in New Hampshire, never done very well. Oz in Pennsylvania, very inexperienced, a lot of blunders in that campaign. There were a couple of candidates who did survive. Vance in Ohio, who wasn't much of a candidate, did survive, but that was partly because there was an awful lot of money that came into that campaign from outside groups, again, the billionaires and the corporations. And the Democrats did not support Vance's opponent, a guy named Tim Ryan, who deserved a lot better and who might have come closer if he'd had more support. Part of the reason that those candidates helped the Democrats to win was that sizable numbers of Republican voters, either because the candidates were so bad, crossed over and voted for the Democrat, or they just didn't vote for that office. In Georgia, you probably know that the Republican candidate for governor, Brian Kemp, won handily over Stacey Abrams. 200,000 Republican voters who supported Kemp did not vote for Senate because they just couldn't bring themselves to vote for Herschel Walker, whether it was because of his personal history or because he didn't seem to know much of anything about the issues. Whatever the reason was, that was very important in keeping his vote total down and producing the result that we've seen with the runoff. By contrast, most of the Democratic candidates, people like Fetterman in Pennsylvania or Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, Reverend Warnock in Georgia, they were capable people. Some of them were incumbents, some of them weren't, but they knew what they were doing and they ran good campaigns, and that made a difference. And here we come to the campaigns themselves. There were thousands and thousands of volunteers for Democrats. There were women motivated by the Roe v. Wade overturn. There were young people also motivated by that, but by other issues as well, union members, grassroots groups, and they did the nitty-gritty work of campaigning. They knocked on the doors. They made the phone calls. They wrote the letters. They drove turnout. Turnout was high in this election. And in general, the higher turnout is, the better it is for Democrats. We know that it's this kind of personal contact, having somebody come and knock on your door, or getting a letter or a phone call or a text, that matters. There's political science research that has measured the effects of this kind of campaigning, and it does in fact bring more people out to vote. It persuades more people to vote for your candidate, but it also just increases the numbers of people who actually get to the polls. In terms of voting blocks, in terms of groups, we've already talked about women and young people who organized and voted in very high numbers. Here are the details. There was a 53 to 54% gender gap, with women voting more for the Democrats than men. By the way, if you want to see the details on this, CNN has the exit poll data. If you just go to their website, you can get all this information. You can get, it's broken down by age and income and everything else. One thing to note is that this gender gap conceals the fact that white women still voted more for Republicans than they did for the Democrats. So it's women of color, younger people who are voting overwhelmingly for the Democrats. In one battleground state, for instance, in Pennsylvania, 72% of the young women, huge margin, voted for the Democratic candidate Fetterman, who was the eventual winner. And there were also in these races a small number of Republican women, as I suggested before, who crossed over to vote for the Democrats. And when the race is close, as it was in Arizona, for instance, that can make a big difference. Not maybe so much in Pennsylvania, because Fetterman, I think, won by 5 or 6 points. But yes, it would have mattered in Arizona. Young people. Young people, the background here is young people's turnout is ordinarily extremely low. Used to, hover in the teens. It's gotten better recently. And in this election, 27% of this youngest group actually turned out to vote. Now, that may seem like a pretty dismal turnout, but comparatively, it's very good. It's the second highest turnout in a midterm election. The only one that's been higher was 2018. And people in this age group made up 12% of the electorate, and even more than that in battleground states. So in terms of turnout, there's an increase. And in terms of the partisan swing, over 60% of those people voted for the Democrats, and it was higher in battleground states. If you look at the Hispanic vote, there's been a lot of talk about how, the Hispanic vote and the Black votes shifting in the direction of the Republicans. And it may be true that there are small shifts in that direction. But it's also true that if you look at it overall, they're still voting heavily for the Democrats, and they are still a major reason why the Democrats win elections. So among Latinx voters, at least 60% vote for the Democrats. And then again, in the battleground states, it's often higher. I don't know if you can see this chart or not, so I'll read you some of it. In Michigan, 74% of Latinx voters vote for the Democrats. In Pennsylvania, 73%. So you can see, and nowhere is it less than 63, except in Florida, where you've got the big, very conservative Cuban bloc of voters. So in general, Latinx voters are supporting the Democrats very strongly. And the Black vote also went heavily to the Democrats, even more strongly. 85% of the Black vote went to the Democrats. So again, there may be a little bit of a shift toward the Republicans, but so far at least, it's not damaging the Democrats in any serious way. So that's the good news. Comes now the bad news. There were still a lot of election deniers elected. That's just a fact. And some of them are federal office holders. There are probably 125, 135, maybe 150 members of the House of Representatives who are election deniers. And there are, as you know, some senators as well: Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, Cotton. There's a bunch. So that's a considerable block of votes, and probably the Supreme Court of the United States would be available for some kinds of election manipulations. They've already refused to deal with gerrymandering. More bad news at the federal level. Ron Johnson, one of the leading election deniers, the incumbent senator from Washington, who was challenged by a very good candidate named Mandela Barnes, who was the lieutenant governor, got reelected narrowly. He got a lot of help from big money donors, so-called dark money, meaning it came from groups that don't have to disclose who their donors are, thanks to the Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case. And he used that money for a series of racist attack ads against Mandela Barnes, falsely accusing him of being soft on crime and associating him with African Americans who had committed crimes. It was reminiscent, those of you who remember back to the Willie Horton commercials that Bush the Elder ran against Michael Dukakis, will recognize this, this pattern. Unfortunately, the Democrats did not anticipate this attack and didn't carry out what would have been the right thing to do, which is a so-called inoculation campaign. What you're supposed to do when you're running a campaign is to think ahead of time, what are the attacks going to be against my candidate? And then go ahead and construct a series of advertisements or speeches or whatever that defend the candidate. So in this case, you would have tried to make clear that Barnes had a strong stand on issues related to physical security and criminal justice. As far as I know, that did not take place, which was too bad, because Johnson, as I say, one of the leading election deniers, particularly, in my view, I'll offer you an opinion here, a particularly odious human being, who, among other things, tried to give a slate of fake electors to Mike Pence just before all hell broke loose on Capitol Hill on January 6th. Two other Senate candidates backed by Trump were victorious. J.D. Vance, I've already talked about, in Ohio. And also the candidate that Trump endorsed for the Senate in North Carolina. And here again, some people have been critical of the national Democrats, saying that Cheryl Beasley, the African-American woman who was the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, didn't get the help from the national Democrats that she should have gotten. And finally, as I've mentioned previously, most of the Republican members of the House of Representatives who were elected and reelected are election deniers. And on top of that, there's a lot of Republicans at the state and local level. This should remind you of what I started with, that extremism in the Republican Party is not something that, began in 2016 with Donald Trump. There are deep roots within the Republican Party of this kind of authoritarianism. And these people are not going to give it up easily. They're not going to stop trying to overthrow majority rule. They're going to continue to try to make Republicans the dominant party in the United States. They're going to try to turn the United States into a one-party state in the same way that Hungary's a one-party state and Turkey's a one-party state and Russia's a one-party state. They still have elections, but they don't mean anything. So just to conclude on the election, this was a good day for democracy. The worst was avoided. Some strong supporters of democracy were elected, but there is a very strong anti-democratic force that remains. And I'm going to shift now to one of the aftermaths, one of the follow-on events to the election, which is Donald Trump's announcement that he's going to seek the presidency again in 2024. As you know, a lot of the press, a lot of the media was derisive about this, very critical of Trump. The Wall Street Journal, which had supported him previously, put him down. New York Post, Fox News, Murdoch's had enough of Trump. He's transferring his support to DeSantis. So all these folks are jumping ship, and there have been announcements from several big donors, billionaires, that they're also not supporting Trump anymore. And maybe the unkindest cut of all, even Ivanka has said that she's not going to be politically active and support her dad. She's going to stay home with the kids. I mean, that's tough to take if you're the Donald, I would think. But the jury's still out on this. It's not at all clear how the base of the Republican Party, which has been so supportive of Trump, is going to respond when we actually get into primaries. There have been polls supposedly that show that DeSantis is ahead of Trump, but it's anybody's guess what's going to happen when there's an actual conflict, when there's an actual campaign, when DeSantis and Trump are going head to head. More important, however, in terms of how this whole issue of democracy is evolving, is the very misleading treatment that's being put forward by the mainstream media. They're focusing on Trump as if he were the whole problem, as if he had created all the anti-democratic forces in American politics. And they're starting to present DeSantis as a kind of a wholesome alternative. Two things are crucial. One, it's the party, not the person, that mattered. There's no doubt that compared to other Republicans, Trump was more aggressive, nastier, louder, more vulgar, more bombastic, more of a jerk personally than any other Republican. That's fine. But he isn't different in kind from the other Republican leaders who used the same methods for the past 30 years. So it's the party that matters, not the person. And as far as DeSantis is concerned, to treat him as though he were a quote unquote normal politician is absurd. He is an extremist. He is anti-small d Democratic. He's the guy that gerrymandered the congressional districts in Florida and gained 4 seats for the Republicans, which may turn out to be the margin of victory. He's the one who's been demonizing immigrants. You all know about his little stunts with flying them around the country under false pretenses. And he's a prime practitioner of intimidating voters, particularly voters from minority communities. He created a whole unit in the state police that focuses exclusively on supposed violations of voting laws. And one of the extremely nasty things they've done is to go after people who used to be incarcerated, mostly Black people, some of whom have been told that they passed all the tests for regaining their voting rights and went ahead and voted because state officials told them that they were okay, and then found themselves arrested and sometimes prosecuted, because there was some technicality or they'd been misled in some way. So DeSantis is a prime practitioner of anti-majority rule politics. So why then is he getting framed as the good guy? Well, I've got it all here in terms of words that begin with S. He is saner, smoother, smarter, and he talks better than Trump. So just in terms of appearance, in terms of these superficial characteristics, it's easy for him to pass himself off as a normal conservative, but he's not. He really isn't. Partly for the reasons I've already stated, partly because of what he's done, but also, again, I apologize for the typo, the Republican Party is an extremist organization. You cannot get to be prominent, popular in the Republican Party unless you are also an extremist. It's just that simple. So a word to the wise, be vigilant. Watch out that the mainstream media isn't selling you a bill of goods and normalizing somebody that ain't normal. That's one part of the work that we need to do if we're going to preserve our deeply flawed democracy. And the other thing, keep in mind, quoting the old spiritual, is that freedom's a constant struggle. This fight's going to go on for at least another 20 years. And partly it'll happen in elections, but it's going to happen across the board. Union organizing, campaigns to deal with the climate crisis, to protect women's rights and LGBTQ rights, to gain racial and economic justice. So there's going to be a lot to do. And I thank you all for what you have been doing. And I thank you for your attention tonight. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Michael. I think we had decided to stop the recording during the question and answer period in light of privacy. So if you could do that, Michelle.
I had made an alternate suggestion. I don't know, I guess you didn't see it, that if people don't want to be seen, they could just turn their video off.
Name
They
is
could-
still there, Michelle. Name is still there.
No, and they can,
Not everybody knows how to take their name off. I don't know how to do that.
okay, then I will turn off the recording.
Thank you.